In the plaza. He was born in a hut made of twigs and mud that leaned against a straw-colored hill. The road to the village went past the door, and at the age of 1, he knew that the people who said hello instead of adios were Americanos and very rich. They gave money away for nothing, his father said. Money bought sweet rolls and candy sticks. So he had no time to play on the dirt floor with his older brother. He had no time to wonder, as his father and grandfather had wondered, sitting on the same wooden doorstep, whether the huddled hills were the backs of giant burros, as an old story told, or if the distant mountains that lay in great golden tan curves held bubbles of air that might escape at the puncture of a pick and let the whole world down. He had time only to watch for Americanos. He could tell them by their pale faces and their new clean clothes. When he saw one, he would rush out into the road, naked as he was, grin and say, "Allo," and hold out his palm. The coins always fell. At 4, he loitered around the smaller plaza in the village, where the buses unloaded. He learned to say, "Can I help you, lady?" and "Can I help you, sir?" And always he was given centavos, because the words meant, could he carry the suitcases that were as big as he was and weighed a lot more? If he talked fast, he could get money from all the turistas before the older boys, his brother Antonio among them, could carry off their suitcases. He learned to say, "That is the best hotel," as he pointed up the road to a big white house, and if people went there, he trotted after them and collected a peso from the hotel manager. The rate at the hotel was 125 pesos a day, but for the Americanos, this fortune was nothing. When he saw an American, he did not see a person at all, but centavo pieces and red and green peso notes. It fascinated him to watch them buy in the silver shops. They selected things quickly, as if they were eager to get rid of their money, and there was never any back-and-forth talk about the price. The women had even more pesos than the men. Every American was a money bag he had merely to puncture with a smile and hold his hands to. His only competition was a loose army of other small boys which roamed the village, but the competition was not serious because he, in distinction from all the rest, was cute. Cute was a word nearly all the Americans said when they gave him money. It meant he did not have to carry suitcases as the others did, that all he had to do was smile and hold out his palm. His last name happened to be Palma, but several years were to pass before he learned the English word palm. In the evening, he impressed his parents by shouting the Inglés he had learned. "Easy on that camera!" and "Put that with the rest!" "Por Dios, Alejandro!" his pious mother exclaimed. She was beginning to worry about him. He was only home to sleep. Already he did not want to go to the cathedral because, he said, the Americans did not go and were much richer than the Mexicans. He was supposed to lay the money he had earned on the table every evening as Antonio did, but Alejandro could always conceal most of it in his pockets because his father was not clever. He could buy all the ice cream sodas and chocolates he wanted. He could buy factory-made shirts in the marketplace. Never did he buy anything for his parents like Antonio. Wasn't it enough what his father took from him enabled them to have coffee and fresh meat all the time? Without him, they would still be eating nothing but tortillas and frijoles that his father got in exchange for his wooden saddles and his mother's serapes. The cleverest Mexicans, he told his parents, were not farmers of corn or makers of wooden saddles, but guides, silver shop owners and hotel owners, people who did things for the Americans. Therefore, his parents were stupid. So was Antonio, who worked like a burro carrying suitcases but did not earn half what he did just by smiling. He taunted Antonio for his stupidity in English that Antonio could not understand, and in the older boy arose a jealousy that became hatred. It was true that the town subsisted on money that came from the tourists. The village whored after money. Some of the natives had much money, some hardly any, but all paid the high prices for basic needs which the extravagance of the tourists had brought about. The tourists took the best houses and the best food because they had the money to pay for them, while the natives, whose great-great-grandparents had been born here, lived on what was left. It was ironic that this had happened to their village simply because the village had happened to be so pretty. Beneath a superficial cheerfulness, hatred against the tourists ran like an underground stream that rose in the eyes of bent old men sometimes, and in the faces of small children who had not yet learned to hide it. Most American tourists moved too fast to detect it, but some Americans who had made the village their home detected it, and then began to see it everywhere, even in the eyes of the strayed dogs in the plaza and behind the smile of the hotel managers who spoke English perfectly. They could never escape it, except by drinking. Alejandro learned English almost as easily as Spanish, and in time, the languages were side by side in his mind. He listened for new English words, and earned extra centavos if he asked the Americans what a certain word meant. He learned the value of dissembling friendship, of remembering names. If he smiled, waved a hand, and called, "Hello there, Mr. So-and-so," to a tourist he had got money from before, he would be tossed more money. By tagging after a group of tourists, babbling English, he would be invited sometimes as a kind of court jester to one of the hotel dining rooms to share a meal his parents could not imagine even after he described it. One day, when he was about 7, his offer to help a lady was accepted, and he had to carry a small bag up the longest hill to a hotel. He took his 2-peso tip sullenly, and when he had walked back down the hill, he was resolved to become a guia, a guide. All the guides did was walk around and talk. So he went past the buses to the main plaza, where, under the tall plane trees before the cathedral, the guides made up their parties. "Can I show you the town, ladies and sirs?" he asked, with the same winning smile he had used at the bus stop. He competed with boys much older than he, more capable of supporting the plump, middle-aged women who turned their ankles going down the steep cobblestones. But generally, the women would say something to their men with the word cute in it, and he would be beckoned to. In the plaza also was his brother Antonio, who at 14 had just graduated from porter to guide in the town's curriculum. Antonio, with his indifferent English and his square, serious face. Alejandro laughed at him and took his customers from under his nose. Antonio had memorized the whole guidebook and did not know how to pronounce the words right, and besides, one American on a holiday wanted such a sad lecture. Antonio and he were real rivals now, and seldom spoke to each other. It was hard to believe they were brothers, solemn Antonio and the happy-eyed little Alejandro. Alejandro had trailed the guides often enough to know the things they pointed at and what they said, such as, "This cathedral costed 10 billions of pesos." But he varied the ordinary tour. With the gestures of an experienced host, his small figure led groups of 10 and 12 from silver shop to a picturesque street to silver shop. The guides made commissions on the purchases, to the cathedral, to a beautiful view, a tour neither too short nor too long, that ended happily at one of the 2 high-class bars in the plaza, where a drink made with 2 jiggers of tequila and mentioned in every guidebook was served. Alejandro became the most popular guide of the village. His age and size were a novelty. His customers told their friends to ask for him, and there were always those tourists who came every year and had known him since he was 4, who took pleasure in introducing him to their friends who were seeing the village for the first time. He made from 60 to 70 pesos a day. The bulge of banknotes so delighted him, he got in the habit of walking with one hand in his pocket to feel it, which emphasized his easy, jaunty poise. He bought brilliantine for his softly curling hair to make it shine with blue highlights. He bought trousers like the Americans wore that sold for 40 pesos in the market, kept them freshly washed and pressed, and never forgot to close the zipper as many Mexican boys did, an omission he knew was remarked unfavorably by the American women. He struggled to read American magazines. He went to every American movie that came to the 2 picture houses in the town and learned new words by comparing them with the Spanish written at the bottom of the screen. He cut and parted his hair after the fashion of American actors and dressed himself as nearly like them as he could. The word cute he heard less often now than good-looking. He was 12 years old. Already his face was lean and manly, with an astute expression that suggested more years than he had. His body was a lithe 5 feet 5 inches and weighed 115 pounds, in American measurements. Of all the young men of the village, he was the most handsome, and he noticed the effect of this on women. It was the furtive embraces of the American women as they caught at him, slipping down the lanes. Their hasty, shy pecks on his cheeks and lips after their second tequilas that awakened his desires. All the guides were familiar with this nervous love-making of the American women and laughed at it. Often they boasted to their comrades, as they pointed out this or that pretty American girl, that it had been she with whom they spent the night, half jokingly, half as if they expected to be believed. So did Alejandro boast, though he had seduced only one girl, and she was a Mexican, Concha, the prettiest muchacha in the village. He had been 11, and she 13. But this was nothing. One little peck from an American woman, no matter how old or ugly she was, counted more, because she was American. And really, Mexican girls had never attracted him. He liked American girls with blonde hair, like those he saw in the movies, and sometimes getting off the buses or driving into the village in their cars. He longed to seduce one. This desire began to be stronger even than his passion for money. His first American girl was a well-developed, blue-eyed young lady of 15, with blonde hair that curled at the ends and hung part way down her back. It was the blonde hair that fascinated him, the blank, staring blue eyes that encouraged him. Her name was Mary Jane Howell, and she was with her mother. He took them and some other tourists around the village, then was invited to lunch at a hotel by Mrs. Howell, to whom he had been especially courteous. After lunch, Mrs. Howell wanted to go shopping, but Mary Jane said she would stay behind. Having directed Mrs. Howell to a silver shop, Alejandro returned to the hotel just as Mary Jane was stepping from behind a potted palm in the lobby with her eyes even wider, even more fixed. He gave her his most charming smile, copied from a certain American actor, on the left side of his face with his eyes narrowed to crescents of long black lashes. "I show you that map I told you upstairs, yes? There is much breeze down here, no?" "Yes," she said. He could have spoken better English, but he knew when to use an accent. He followed her into the room, and almost before he could close the door, Mary Jane had locked her arms around his neck and planted a moist, warm kiss on his lips. Hardly half an hour later, he was downstairs, walking automatically, though buoyantly, toward the plaza. His tongue leapt in his mouth to tell of his conquest, and in the next quarter hour he told it 4 times, in increasing detail, to as many guides and plaza loiterers as would listen. They believed him now, because he believed himself. The realization of his triumph was stronger in the plaza than it had been in Mary Jane's room. A blonde American girl. Later, when Mary Jane and her mother walked about the village, they were followed by the eyes of almost the entire male population. Thereafter came many American girls. There were a few rebuffs, but Alejandro could take success and failure with the same pleasant bow and smile, which often turned matters his way after all. He came to be known as the bad boy of the village, and enjoyed a worse reputation than he deserved. His walk was haughty, its tense grace suggestive of a well-cared-for tomcat, and he was always walking, roving the town. He held his narrow head high. Merely the glance of his dark eyes was half the conquest of the women he wanted. At 15, he received 2 or 3 letters a week from American girls, school teachers, married women, beginning, "Dearest boy, darling, my Spanish angel," ending with dirges of their boring existences in the States, and a wish that the joys they had known might sometime, somewhere, be relived. These letters he read conspicuously, sitting on the benches in the plaza where the plane trees dappled them with rich shadow and glaring sunspots. He put them in his hip pocket with the American stamp showing at the top, and strolled off in quest of more girls. Some of the letters he answered in careful English. Most were not worth the trouble. He had found a new ambition. He wanted to marry an American woman, a wealthy one, and live like the prince he was for the rest of his life. There were many marriages between Mexican boys and American women in the village. One of their homes was the most palatial house he had ever seen. But he was still young, and it was difficult for a Mexican boy to marry an American woman before he was 17. He must act older. Concentrate on the wealthiest and freest of the American women and charm them out of their senses. For 6 months, he charmed a score of American women out of their senses, but none seemed to want marriage. American women expected casual romances as part of the village's entertainment. They enjoyed the jealousy of the American men, their nervous anger, or their badly pretended boredom, when they made engagements with young Mexicans. The women seemed to play a game just for the pleasure of reconciliation with their man at the end of their stay. Alejandro took his disappointments with a smile and a shrug. American women were not all so elusive. The woman for him would come. One day, a woman like none Alejandro had seen before strolled into the plaza on the arm of a well-dressed gentleman with red hair. Was she American? Alejandro examined her from head to toe. She held herself as proudly as he did. She carried a long cigarette holder and wore high-heeled green lizard pumps, in which she seemed to glide rather than walk over the cobbles that turned other women's ankles, even when they wore straw sandals. She looked bored, and it seemed to be the man's idea that they see the town, though it was she who selected him as their guide. She did not look at the things he pointed to, but kept her gray-green eyes on him in a sleepy, thoughtful way that gave Alejandro an odd feeling. She was not attractive, and yet she was. At any rate, and the thought gave him his bearings again, there was no doubt she had much money. Earrings of hammered gold circles hung below the lacquered, upswept black hair. The pale green tweed skirt had been made for her, and the gray silk blouse, too, and perhaps also the green lizard belt that matched her shoes. She did not want to enter the cantina with the others at the end of the tour. She stopped just outside the door, looking at Alejandro, who hung there too, as if she were the only member of his party. "What is your name?" she asked him, in a voice like a distant pipe organ and with a smile that revealed interesting teeth, one partially of gold. "Alejandro Palma, at your service." He could not look back at her face after his bow. Never had he felt like this, and he did not know if it was shyness, attraction, or dislike. "Alejandro," she repeated, rolling the R as easily as he. The gray-green eyes, half-shaded by crinkly lids, blinked at him affectionately. "Well, perhaps I see you tomorrow again, Alejandro. Today I was too tired to enjoy your village." "My pleasure," Alejandro bowed. Her escort offered his arm with an absent-minded resignation, and Alejandro watched her move off in a slinking gait that set one foot in a line with the other. Then he dispatched for 50 centavos a small boy to ascertain at what hotel she was staying, her name and that of the man. The boy reported back that she was a countess. The next morning, she was in the plaza before 9 o'clock, before Alejandro had begun to make up his first party. She wore flat iguana sandals now that made her feet look even longer and narrower. She said she wanted a drink, so they went to Cesar's Cantina, a tequila-soaked niche in the wall of one of the lanes off the plaza, since the better cantinas were not yet open. In Cesar's, the fleas were so thick one could see them hopping here and there on the red tile floor in search of a human leg. Two dirty Mexicans slouched over the low bar. In an open-collared white shirt and white linen trousers, Alejandro sat erectly at a little table with the Countess. He spoke English loudly and distinctly, proud to be seen by Cesar and the two Mexicans with the elegant woman who also spoke English, used a holder for her Russian cigarettes, and was, in every respect, beyond the iron tradition that forbade women to enter such a cantina. To her questions, Alejandro replied that he was 18, though he was only 16, said that he had been educated at the Academia Inglesa in Mexico City. She lifted the tiny tequila glass in her bony hand, drank it off without salt or lime, and looked at him calmly. "You are very handsome. You appear a little Spanish. Is it so?" "My father and mother, they were pure Castilian," Alejandro said, lowering his eyes sensitively. One of Cesar's fighting cocks, combless and limping like an old man, was entering the cantina, pecking at the floor. The Countess smiled and blinked her eyes at him, and though it was a tender smile, he felt she knew he lied. "Me? I am nothing, because I am everything. Do you understand?" She smiled again. "Like you." He did not understand, and he did. "What about your friend?" "Robert?" She laughed and waved a hand that drifted back to the silver cigarette case that had initials on it and a crest. "Robert told me yesterday a goodbye forever." Again Alejandro could not look at her, could not say any of the things it was now time for him to say. "No, do not walk back with me, Alejandro." With a bored air, she had got up. "Visit me tonight at 10 if you care to. You know my name already, don't you? Countess Lemokov. Paula." Alejandro was there at 10. He had been unable to work all day for anxiety. In the disorderly room where her possessions obliterated the Mexican decor, the Countess made bewildering love to him, wooed and won him and covered him with heavy, tender kisses, insulted him by laughing at his love-making, though she made Alejandro laugh too. She told him his language of love was more broken than his English. She made him frantic to please her. All he desired was that she let him see her again. "Of course, tomorrow we are going to Acapulco." She lay on her back, blowing the smoke of her Russian cigarette toward the ceiling. "Already I have telephoned reservations in a hotel." In the morning, he packed some of his best shirts and slacks into a valise he had just bought. "Where are you going?" asked his mother, who was putting on a pot of beans in the outdoor kitchen. "Quien sabe?" he answered sourly, then began to smile as he walked down the hill. His mother would think he was merely going to Mexico City again, and this might be the last time he would see his home. He did not look back. The world spread bigger and bigger before him. The Countess filled it all. He drove the Countess's shiny black Jaguar out of the village and turned its chromium radiator cap on the road to Acapulco. The Countess was quiet and thoughtful, and kept her eyes on the road even when she took swallows out of the long, thin bottle of tequila añeja she had brought to celebrate. Alejandro had never felt so happy and so carefree. Though his time had always been his own, his days spent in the out-of-doors, he had always been working to earn money. Now he did not think about money. He did not want money from the Countess. He did not want to marry her unless she wished it. He thought of his marriage to anyone as a fraud, and he did not want to cheat the Countess. Just how he felt he could not say, because he did not know the meaning of the words respect, affection, or love. And they did not occur to him now. In Acapulco, they stayed at the favorite hotel of the season, where their suite and meals were 350 pesos a day. The Countess bought him a bathing suit consisting of a strip of chartreuse material splotched with vermilion flowers. With this wrapped around his narrow hips, he swam at Hornos Beach in the mornings and at Coleta in the afternoons, lulled with the Countess on the sand, while she, marking with her sunglasses her place in the book she never read for gazing at him, stroked the curls back from his forehead or dribbled the white sand down the brown hairless arch of his chest. Often, after tamarind highballs on the hotel terrace, they drove to Pie de la Cuesta, a promontory 15 kilometers away. Here they lay in hammocks strung only a few feet from the wave's edge, sipped coconuts through straws, and watched the sun drop into the water like a world on fire. They dined at all the hotels for variety, and had whole banquets sent up to their rooms. Generally, they retired early, because the Countess needed much sleep. She told him of her childhood in Poland on her father's great estate, where 300 serfs tended vast wheat fields, of her narrow escape when Hitler came, of her life afterward in Paris and in New York. Alejandro did not believe a tenth of it, but he listened with the respect he would have demanded of a listener if he had told a comparable story of his life in Mexico. And this was what drew them together. Their common habit of lying, their fellowship of falseness, their dependence on the timid man's fascination by the outrageous. Where had she got her money? She had none, she said. She lived on credit. When my credit will be gone, then I shall be gone also. And when Alejandro looked alarmed, I could not live at all if I did not live in danger. Neither can you, Alejandro. Even after you marry, you will see. Make a wise marriage, not a stupid one. Marry an ugly woman if you can, or if she is pretty, be sure she is stupid. But they usually are. You don't yet understand all, but you will. She taught him as if she were a school of manners, morals, love, hypocrisy, and opportunism. He was her protégé, son, lover, and husband, because he would finally need to know how to be a husband, quite a different art from that of lover. She supervised the cutting of his hair, dramatizing the ripples in back and at his temples, balancing the curve of his head with an orderly clump that fell partially over his forehead. She imposed an English restraint in his dress, taught him 1,000 little graces for different places and occasions, all without embarrassing him, even contriving to flatter him. And Alejandro learned with the ease and pleasure of one whose life is devoted to ease and pleasure and the pleasing of others. He burst into bloom. The Countess and the tropical sun caressed him. He caressed the whole world. Happiness. How could she make him so happy, he wondered, when 1,000 times a day she criticized him, caught him in a lie, impressed some trivial matter on his mind like a school teacher? Yet he felt that his happiness was traced with every movement of his body like an invisible design in the air. Wasn't that why everyone gazed at him on the beaches? Even men, who always loathed him, took secret pleasure in watching him disport himself. His figure poised for a moment against the bright blue water as he sought the Countess, his flight up the beach to the older woman who was clearly not his mother and to whom he seemed so devoted, began many conversations he knew. 2 blonde American women angled for him at the hotel, but Alejandro was not once tempted to be false to the Countess. He spent his evenings close by her side, usually in white linen slacks. The Countess liked him in white linen. A dark green or blue sport shirt with one of her silk handkerchiefs knotted at his throat, listening and talking to her as if she were the only woman in the world. People in the hotel could not figure them out, but how they loved to watch. Alejandro never stopped to ask himself if he were in love with the Countess, and, probably because his emotions for 16 years had been so false, he could not have given himself a truthful answer. He dropped postcards to his friends back in the village, telling of his extravagant, carefree life, of how voluptuous was La Condesa, and of course of how many new conquests he had made. He wrote also to Concha, his first amour, and now the betrothed of Antonio, and sent her a necklace of small gray seashells he had bought from a peddler for 2 pesos. After 6 weeks, the Countess could find only the most minute faults in Alejandro. The sandpapering was over, she told him. The rest would be with emery dust. Now he learned how to make at least one incontrovertible statement on such subjects as abstract art, Negroes in America, communism in Latin America, and Wagnerian opera. "I do not want you should any more be a guide," the Countess said one day in the absent monotone that meant her thoughts were far ahead of her words. "You should be manager of a fine hotel in your village." Alejandro said something evasive. He was much too busy being happy to think about working or about the future. The Countess turned from the window in fury. "Do not be lazy. You have in you that stupid laziness of your stupid country, and if you cannot step it down, we say goodbye forever this minute. Yes, your country is full of stupid, lazy people, like your parent. Yes, I know all about your parents, stupid boy. Like you would be without me. Don't deny it." She shook him hard by the shoulders. "You will not grow up to be a lazy fat bum. You will grow up to be Sing. Understand?" Alejandro got up, bowed as she wished him to do, and murmured, "The woman I love can make the impossible possible. And this is not even the impossible, my sly one. You know that." The Countess smiled. The next morning, she did not join him on the beach after her usual letter-writing period after breakfast. Alejandro went back to the hotel and was told she had checked out. Trembling, he opened the envelope the clerk handed him, conscious of the dramatic figure he made before the clerk and the 2 blonde Americans standing nearby, of the tragedy in his young face, of the new blue banknotes he let flutter to his feet. A short letter with many interpolated terms of affection told him she had spoken with the manager of the hotel at which she had stopped in his village, and that it was all but certain he could become the receptionist there, second in importance only to the manager himself, she reminded him. The bill was paid at the Acapulco Hotel for the next 5 days, and he was to enjoy himself and not think of her, forget her with someone else if he wanted to. How strange I should have found in Mexico one so like myself. Bless you and thank you, my darling. But do not try to thank me except by to remember a few of the things I have told you. Never think you may see me again. Never think I forget you. Your Paula, Countess Lomolkov." The last 2 words were underlined. Alejandro was too lonely to stay on. Dimly he realized he cared more for her than he had admitted, and he could not bear to face it, so he caught a bus back to the village. Once more the world opened itself wide to him on the mountain road. He could face the world more easily than the loss of the Countess. He must turn his eyes outward, live dangerously, as she had said. Before nightfall, he had spoken to Señor Martinez, the manager of the hotel. Alejandro's bearing, his knowledge of English, even Señor Martinez did not know much English, got him the job. Señor Martinez, a shy, serious man eager for the Americanization of the hotel, had agreed with the Countess on the telephone that an English-speaking receptionist would be an advantage. Alejandro, then, was the likely young man she had promised to send. Alejandro's reputation would have prescribed him, but the manager's monastic habits had kept it from reaching his ears. In the hotel, Alejandro wore either white or gray flannel with a red flower always in his buttonhole. It was his job to welcome guests, see that their rooms were satisfactory, that their breakfast orders were correctly filled before the trays left the kitchen, to invite lonely women guests out for cocktails occasionally, the bills to be paid by the hotel. He flew smoothly about the two-story patioed building, set a vase of bougainvilleas in a certain room, brought raw meat for the dog in another, replaced small light bulbs with larger ones, and gave every guest the impression that he or she was his favorite. There was never a complaint against Alejandro, and there were many tips, many commendations to Señor Martinez. When some of the señor's friends remarked that Alejandro had reformed, the señor did not know what they meant. Alejandro did not earn quite as much as he had as a guide, but his new position carried greater dignity, and dignity was important, the Countess had told him, to an American woman who considered marrying a Mexican. Since starting his job at the hotel, his ambition to marry a wealthy American woman had returned with new force. He was so much better equipped now. He longed to succeed. Only the wealthiest women merited his invitations to cocktails. He made engagements with wealthy women staying at other hotels, too. All the bills were sent to Señor Martinez with notations that they were for such and such señoras or señoritas stopping at the hotel. Often, he invited young ladies to the hotel to spend the evening in a room that happened to be free. This deception might have gone on indefinitely, if not for one indiscretion that would certainly have brought the severest tongue-lashing from the Countess. Concha had married Antonio, who was now 24 and still not graduated from the guide class. Alejandro and Concha saw each other every Saturday night, when Antonio was busy taking tourists on a round of the bars until they closed at midnight. Antonio was now trying to teach Pancho, their 14-year-old cousin, how to be a guide, so he was quite occupied. Pancho tagged along with him everywhere, even on Saturday nights, and since he was as serious and stupid as Antonio, Alejandro knew he would turn out the same way as his brother, adequate as a guide, perhaps, but without a very interesting future. Alejandro and Concha were fond of each other, but far from being in love. It was just that they enjoyed reliving the childhood amour they had known 6 years before. Concha liked to laugh, and Alejandro laughed so much more than Antonio, and it amused Alejandro to give horns to his brother. It was Concha's birthday. Señor Martinez was in Mexico City overnight on business, and the bridal suite in the hotel happened to be free. Alejandro thought it would be fun to bring Concha there. Concha was delighted with the idea. She and Alejandro went to the hotel, telephoned down for rum and tostadas with sour cream, and pretended they were newlyweds. At 11:30, when they came downstairs, whom should they see behind the desk but Señor Martinez? Alejandro said, "Buenas noches, señor," like a gentleman, escorted Concha home, but he knew it was the end. Señor Martinez knew that Concha was a married woman who lived in the village. Alejandro could have bribed the help, but not Señor Martinez, who would never forgive him. Alejandro was discharged that same night. Alejandro was too optimistic to fear that Antonio would hear of the evening through Señor Martinez, but he spent over 1,000 pesos bribing the staff. For a few days, Alejandro felt nervous and resentful. He was a little afraid of his brother, though when he watched him in the plaza from time to time, he could see no change in him. And when the idea occurred to him that Antonio might take action, he dismissed it as he dismissed his family. He had lived at the hotel since his return from Acapulco, because Antonio was essentially as stupid and ineffectual as his parents. Meanwhile, Alejandro had moved in with an emotionally starved American woman resident of the village, whose young Mexican husband had just abandoned her. He had often called on her before, and now she welcomed him for as long as he cared to stay. Not long after his discharge from the hotel, on one of the afternoons he was idling about the village, too proud, still too well off to worry about earning more money so soon. He wandered into a bookshop off the plaza and saw Mrs. Coots. Mrs. Chester Coots came every summer to the village and stayed 3 or 4 months. Though she was a millionairess and a widow, Alejandro had never considered her because she was so ugly. She wore her hair in a gray bun that could hardly be seen under the strands that escaped it and hung down like gray rags. Her dresses were uniformly gray, too, and so shapeless they might have been slept in. The joke was, she had been cited year after year as one of the 10 wealthiest women of America, and that if she did not look it, then she must be all the wealthier for not spending money on adornment. In a bitter mood, Alejandro flirted brazenly with Mrs. Coots in the bookshop. Mrs. Coots glanced at him, dragged on her cigarette, and chose a book. She had known Alejandro by sight since he had been a little centavo beggar at the bus stop. Alejandro smiled cockily to himself and strolled out of the bookshop in the tracks of Mrs. Coots's run-over Oxfords. She started up the lane that led to the big house she always rented, but the way was so steep. Alejandro lazily turned back, slouched onto a bench in the shade of the plaza's trees, locked his fingers over his flat waist, and dozed for a while, lulled by the hum of Spanish voices around him, by the squeals of children at play. The idea took form in the middle of a little dream. He was enjoying some delicious pleasure because he was married to Mrs. Coots and had money. The dream fell away, but the idea remained. He would court Mrs. Coots and try to marry her. It made him snicker now to think about it. But would the Countess laugh? Alejandro quit the shade of the plane tree as Gautama had quit his Bodhi tree, with a purpose. At about 6 that evening, Alejandro glanced up at the balcony of a bar in the plaza and saw Mrs. Coots at a table alone, drinking one of her brandies. Alejandro went up the stairs without even raking a comb through his hair or pulling his thumbs down the sides of his collar, his habit before going into action. He walked directly to her table and asked if he might join her. She drew on her cigarette, squinted up at him, then gestured to the opposite chair. Alejandro changed his tactics from those of the afternoon. Now he was the gentleman the Countess would have advised him to be. He behaved as if the sleek Countess had been sitting opposite him instead of dowdy Mrs. Coots. He asked if she was enjoying her stay, and she replied, not particularly, that she came every year because of her asthma. She spoke briefly of her ailment, and with an unfeminine frankness. She was interested in buying a house in the village, but couldn't because she was not a citizen or a permanent resident. This gave an opening for the remark that if she married a Mexican, she could buy it in his name, but even he felt it so pointed he could not say it. Do you know the Countess Lamolkov? Mrs. Coots shook her head. Who's she? A lady who was here in the spring. From New York, too. We spent a month together in Acapulco. Mrs. Coots said nothing. Alejandro talked pleasantly for nearly an hour, but nothing of his charm seemed to penetrate. Mrs. Coots only drank brandy after brandy, sipping from a glass of Carta Blanca as a chaser. Then she said something about the fleas in her leather chair eating her alive, and that she wanted to go, He accompanied her to her house, lending her an arm over the rough spots. He lingered at her door, waiting to be asked in to dinner. "Good night," she said without glancing over her shoulder. Alejandro turned away cheerfully, remembering the 100-peso bill she had taken out to pay the check, one of many others in her big worn alligator wallet. He had insisted on paying the check, of course. Appraisingly, he looked at her dark green convertible parked in the alley, flecked with Mexican mud but still showing its 35,000-peso lines. In the plaza, he saw Antonio and Pancho. Antonio came toward him with one hand outstretched. "It's from your mother," Antonio muttered in Spanish as he passed him at arm's length, as if he did not want to befoul himself with touching him. Even Pancho had barely greeted him with a nod. Alejandro looked at what had been dropped into his hand. It was a rosary with a small silver cross he had seen before. He had not been home in over 2 months, and evidently his mother was concerned for his soul. With a big bouquet of red frangipani, Alejandro called on Mrs. Coutts the next morning at 11. A Mexican girl opened the gate, then went to see if Mrs. Coutts would admit him. Finally, Mrs. Coutts herself came slowly down the flagstone walk, frowning against the sun and the smoke from her cigarette, wearing the same dress she had worn yesterday. Her forefinger was in the pages of Guizot's History of France. "What's up?" she asked hoarsely. "Good morning," he smiled, twiddling the bouquet. "I beg to see you a moment. Inside?" She looked at him. "Come on in." He followed her up the steps to the front hall and into a large sunny room with a tile floor and scatter rugs, with comfortable-looking corners that held books and reading lamps and Mexican leather easy chairs. Mrs. Coutts went toward one corner where a laden ashtray and an open bottle of brandy showed she had been sitting. "Drink?" she asked, refilling her glass. Alejandro shook his head. "These are for you." He advanced with the bouquet and bowed as he presented it. She took the flowers as if she had not noticed them before. "Thanks," she said in a tone of surprise. "Juana." When the girl appeared, she gave her the flowers and made gestures at a nearby vase. "Aqua." The girl started to remove the tamarind pods from the vase she had indicated. "No, not that one," Mrs. Coutts said impatiently. "Find an empty one." The girl looked blank. Alejandro rapped out a sentence or two in Spanish, and Juana left the room promptly. Mrs. Coutts stared after the girl, said, "Damn," and tossed off the brandy. She put another cigarette in her mouth, but before Alejandro could get her a light, she had struck on her thumbnail one of the American wooden matches she always carried about her. "Do you like Wagner?" Alejandro asked, fingering a biography of Wagner that lay on a table. "Some. His art songs." She sat down heavily in her chair. "He is too noisy for me," Alejandro said prissily. Mrs. Coutts looked at him as she had looked at the flowers. "Say, what's your name?" "Alejandro. Alejandro Palma, at your service." He bowed again, then seated himself gently on the arm of a divan. "Do you know why I came to see you, Mrs. Coutts?" "Why?" He stood up. An amused smile had forced itself to his lips, and he lowered his head. "Because I am in love with you." He had decided the simple, direct approach was best. "I admire your mind. Your—" But what could he say about her? The hag? Mrs. Coutts got up too, started to pour another brandy, then strolled out onto the side porch, the only move inspired by self-consciousness she could recall ever making. Alejandro was beside her, insinuating his slight body into her arms. He kissed her before she could recover from her surprise to thrust him away, kissed her again. A few yards below and in front of them, a girl named Ermelinda Herrera glanced up from her own roofless terrace, where she sat chewing gum and reading the latest issue of Hoy, and saw an unbelievable sight. The bad boy Alejandro kissing Senora Coots muy caliente, and the senora liking it too. That afternoon, the whole village learned of it. No one would have believed it if Alejandro and the senora had not been seen together so often thereafter. Could they be thinking of getting married? Alejandro's Mexican girlfriends twitted him, and he told them frankly that he was going to marry the senora and for her millions of pesos. He told the guides in the plaza and his friends in Cesar's cantina. Whether it got back to Mrs. Coots before he clinched the marriage was no worry to him. It would sound like typical gossip. Might even be good propaganda. He was having trouble convincing Mrs. Coots that their getting married was at all possible, that someone could love her and want to make her his wife. Mrs. Coots had somehow forgotten she was a human being, but he was teaching her to remember. But the bridge between the two languages did not seem likely to be crossed. Only the Mexicans seemed to talk, and Mrs. Coots had no Mexican friends, and only a nodding acquaintance with a few Americans. They were married in a little chapel of the village with the traditional ceremony of 2 rings and 13 pieces of silver money, symbolic of the union of their worldly estates. Antonio would not even look at Alejandro now when they met, and Concha only stole sidelong glances at him. All his Mexican friends were in awe of him, and he could make them comfortable with him only by getting them drunk. Immediately, Senora Palma bought in the name of Alejandro Palma the house she had rented for so many years from Isidro Barrera, a gift shop owner in the village. Interior decorators came from New York and Mexico City and argued with one another over the deployment of mountains of furniture and drapes Senora Palma had ordered. And when they at last went to work, each seemed bent on making his or her contribution as hideous as possible in order to blame the others. The house became a famous atrocity of the town, and Senora Palma allowed groups of gaping tourists to shuffle through it twice a day, conducted by guides who told them it was an example of the luxuriant embellishment of the Americans who had made the village their permanent home, which it was, and told them it was exquisite, which most of them believed. Senora Palma was flattered, as she had been flattered by Alejandro's attentions. She had grown less introverted, and for a while, Gibbon, Toynbee, Guizot, and Prescott were forgotten in the planning of her house and the honeymoon trip she and Alejandro would make in the fall. After the house was running smoothly under the care of 3 maids who would be paid 200 pesos each per month, she and Alejandro were going to drive in the green convertible to Mexico City, New Orleans, Charleston, New York, the American West, San Francisco, and home again, enjoying themselves where they found things to enjoy, spending money as they pleased. She had never known what pleasure it was to have money until Alejandro showed her how to spend it. She had never known what pleasure companionship was, or what it was to be loved. And she was proud of him. He was handsome, and his grooming inspired a kind of terror and reverence in her. Most of all, and with her self-analyzing temperament she realized it and admitted it, the novelty of him pleased her. The fact that he was a Mexican, that he was so young, that despite all the odds he had come so far with his ludicrous ambitions, his veneer of cosmopolitan gentleman, and his crumbs of information on the Negro problem, Wagnerian music, and Russian history. In another environment, such determination might have made a Napoleon of him, or a Henry Ford. As a historian, she respected his intensity. While preparations for the American tour went on, Alejandro indulged himself in sprees around the village. He bought drinks for whole cantinas, bought gifts of silver and leather for Mexican girlfriends and many new American girls, How much easier it was to get an American girl now that his tailor-made clothes proclaimed from across the plaza that he was rich. There was really no limit to the money he could spend now. He gazed with a dreamy smile at the 5-figured numbers on the Senora's account books, at her stock reports, the Mexican bank account that was in his name as well as hers. And he owned the house, too, one of the biggest in the village, at 17. The night before their departure for the honeymoon, Alejandro decided to visit Cesar's for a final tequila with his old cronies. He heard the jukebox from the cantina as he turned up the lane from the plaza. It played a gay ranchero song that he loved, and he sang with it, "Quien dijo miedo, muchachos? Si para morir nacimos, traigo mi 45 con sus 4 cargadores." He stood for a moment on the threshold of the cantina, smiling on everyone. Drunken shouts greeted him. Many stood up and opened their arms, because even if he were not everyone's personal friend, he had money and would buy rounds of drinks. As the jukebox stopped, a mariachi in the corner began a fast, rollicking song on his guitar. Then Alejandro saw his brother Antonio sitting at one of the little tables. He was the only unfriendly face. Antonio was drunk, and Pancho was beside him, his solemn face frowning and worried. There was something so unfitting in Antonio's being here, something so frightening in Antonio's being drunk, that Alejandro hesitated to go in. Then Pancho stood up, and with his hands in his pockets, still frowning, strolling forward, veered toward the jukebox just to the right of Alejandro, then furtively motioned for Alejandro to step back from the door. Alejandro stepped back into the alley. "Go home," Pancho whispered, "to the house of your parents, by the way of the barranca." Alejandro smiled, but Pancho had turned away and was already strolling back to Antonio. "Alejandro! Coming in!" someone yelled. Still smiling, Alejandro waved a hand in a general goodbye and walked back down the alley. Go home to the house of his parents, indeed, and by the back way. Not on the night before the great trip. He didn't care to get into a fight with Antonio, so he'd give up Cesar's tonight. But back to that mud hovel his parents lived in? It happened at the foot of the steep lane that led to his big house. 2 figures stepped out of the shadows only inches away from his shoulders, and simultaneously they struck at his back. The impact nearly pitched him forward on his face, and when he staggered upright again, he felt he was going to faint. "Hey!" he called, but they had already disappeared, on the run. Then the cobblestones came up and hit him in the face. He crawled around, trying to rise, murmuring for help, for someone, anyone. Then, after a long time, 2 men came and with loud voices lifted him up and asked him questions. "To the house of my parents," Alejandro said in a voice as weak as a whisper. He waved a hand in a certain direction, and he spoke in Spanish. He was dying, no doubt of it. Dying, and there would be no more honeymoon, no more pesos to spend, no more American girls. As the men bore him away, he thought of Antonio sitting at the very table in Cesar's where he and La Contessa... His mother, who undressed him in the hut, found the wounds in his back. Then she called to her husband, who had been standing outside while she did the work of undressing and washing the body. When her husband opened the door, the music of an American dance tune came louder from the hotel on the hill. She pointed to the 2 tiny spots of blood on either side of Alejandro's spine. He had been killed by the daggers with square notched blades that close up the flesh when they are withdrawn, so there is almost no bleeding. In between her sobs, the American dance music came. Finally, the man went to the window and closed the shutter against it. But still, the music came. A few minutes later, they heard a hesitant knock at the door. Alejandro's mother opened the door cautiously. a candle in her hand. She saw an American woman, a very ugly American woman of about 50 years. "What do you wish?" she asked politely. "Is Alejandro here?" the woman asked in heavily accented Spanish. The mother hesitated. "He is here. Who are you, if I may ask you?" She knew how to say it. She remembered it from the day of the wedding. "I am his wife," she said. Then Alejandro's mother slowly raised her hands. The candle dropped, and she let out a wailing, insane scream that reached all the way to the village and echoed and re-echoed across the black hills.